Hello everyone and welcome to the third in our five-part national webinar series addressing the core issues and opportunities of Canada's EV charging infrastructure. I'm Nino De Cara, founder of Electric Autonomy, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that our work is conducted from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. With this national discussion series, we're bringing together speakers from across the country to share their knowledge and best practices, and also to problem solve some of the significant challenges ahead. And I'm delighted to introduce the third episode in this series, How We Build a Resilient Grid. And this episode is sponsored by Eaton. We're grateful to Eaton for their support of this discussion. Canada's grids will face challenges as they prepare to get EV ready, whether it's capacity issues, clean power sources, or the need to upgrade poles, transformers, and transmission wires. Each grid needs are different and nuanced. The panel today will explore options available to utilities as we look at projected demand needed in 2025, 2035 and beyond. And I'm delighted to introduce you to the panel now. They are Michael Voll, Global Sector Leader, Smart Technologies at Stantec Consulting Limited. Dr. Lance Mortlock, Managing Partner, Energy and Resources at EY Canada. Julia Muggeridge, Vice President, Communications and Sustainability at Electricity Canada. Maxime Corbett, Product Manager Canada at Eaton. And my colleague, Emma Jarrett, Executive Editor of Electric Autonomy, who will be moderating today's discussion. Well, we've already had several questions submitted by the audience during the registration process for our panelists. But we'd still love to hear your questions live during the discussion. And so if you'd like to ask a question to the panel, please use the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner, and Emma and the panel will get to as many of them as possible. If you'd like to make a comment or to engage with other members of the audience, please use the chat function. So conversation and comments in the chat box and questions in the Q&A box. And finally, I would like to say that if you click on the three dots in the bottom right of your Zoom window, you will see the option to see captions and also simultaneous translation. You can see those captions in French and in other languages. And so with the introduction all done, I'm delighted to hand over to Emma, and who's going to get the conversation started.
Thanks very much. Oh, I have a request to enable captions. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. It pops up on our screen. Glad everyone is making use of that function. So welcome. Very happy to have our panelists here. They represent a wide swath of the energy and grid sectors. So I'm excited for this discussion. It's, I think, top of mind, especially yesterday with the fall economic statement coming out and there being a lot of energy pieces in that. So Lance, could you kick us off with a big picture view, talking about the macro trends you're noticing in this space with respect to the energy transition, the speed of electrification, and energy demand?
Sure, thanks, Emma. Great first question. A few things to kind of break down that question in terms of the macro trends. Firstly, energy transition and the shift towards utility scale renewable generation continues. I'd also say that electrification in general, both in Canada and more broadly globally, is accelerating. But with that is obviously energy demand, and that's accelerating as well. One interesting statistic that I would share is as we switch to electricity to run our vehicles, to heat our homes, we could nearly triple the amount of power that we're using by 2050, which is an astronomical amount. And government subsidies are going to be required for that. The other macro trend that I think is really important is public policy. And I think it's fair to say that policy is supportive of energy transition and integrating electrification, and we can expect that to continue. Some other major trends that I would highlight is firstly kind of residents and private businesses, moving to distributed energy resources. I think the trend towards greater integration of transmission and distribution is going to be important. North-south ties appear to be more promising than east to west in Canada, and we maybe talk about that a little bit later. And then from a talent perspective, Emma, I'd say that utility companies need to compete with other sectors in terms of attracting talent. And one of the things that strikes me is that there's never been a more exciting time in the power generation, transmission and distribution and retail space. And there's a lot of exciting developments going on.
Thank you so much. So Michael, based on your experience, just tying this into the transportation side, which segment or segments being electrified do you think are going to have the biggest impact on Canada's grids in the near to medium term? And are there hotspots already happening that you can point to, and whether or not they've come up with any innovative solutions to manage that increased load?
Sure, and I guess in follow on to Lance's outlook, and we 100% agree. I mean, this shift to energy transition right now, globally and within Canada, we are seeing investment from government to assist with this. We've got our fall economic statement that's come out. We've already seen some ITC matching with what they're doing in the States. Moreover, we're seeing a focus on greenhouse gas emissions and really taking a closer look at it, of which the transportation sector in Canada is over 22%. That's a pretty big chunk of emissions, even though we have a lot of provinces that are, very low emitting, from nuclear and hydro and other types of things. We still have a fair bit from the transportation. I think what we're going to see from the grid standpoint, when we're looking at electrification of transportation, we're going to continue to see massive investment in large public charging stations, like we've seen national networks, from Electrify and Tesla and others. We're going to continue to see those, especially since, they're increasing federal funding to help assist those programs. But we're going to now start to see, again, as Lance indicated and alluded to, as companies strive to meet their own ESG goals, we're going to start seeing them invest in not only renewable generation and I would say energy efficiency within their own facilities, but electrification of their own fleets. So we're going to start to see, I would call it corporate fleets that are going to start to emerge, which are going to then extend to what we would call depots and fleets. Right? And we're going to continue to see bus fleets transition, and we've seen lots of announcements, and buses are huge, and we'll talk about that later. And we're going to see this extending out to logistics fleets like your Amazons, your Purelators, your FedExes, and your Canadian Tires. They'll all be electrifying their fleets. These are large, predictable loads. And I guess the last sector that's a little bit of a come from behind, but we can't ignore it, are, I would say, the marine sector. When we start looking at things like ferries and major vessels, it's kind of mind-boggling when you think about the energy requirements of all of these sectors in comparison. I mean, as an example, a Class 8 electric truck and a bus, an electric bus, those probably have about 7 times the energy requirement of your typical passenger vehicle. And your passenger ferries have about 25 times the energy requirement. Major vessels, about 300, right? So it's staggering when you think about that. We're working on 2 electric ferry projects right now, one of them in Ontario with more of the passenger type ferries where you've got like an average of 3 megawatt hour packs. And the other one in BC where we're looking at large major vessels that could average 27 megawatt hour packs. What happens when you're seeing those sectors as they're energizing and as they're electrifying, those stations are going to have very low utilization and very low demand factor. So you're going to see big swings in the grid. And that's kind of opens up our discussion on grid resilience and some of the things to do about it.
No, absolutely. And, Julie, I want to bring you in here, obviously, because, Electricity Canada had its big conference yesterday in Ottawa talking about this exact issue and, how to balance things out. And it'd be great to also get your thoughts digging into Lance's point about north-south versus east-west connections, because stating the obvious here, no 2 grids are exactly alike in Canada. They're all very different. So what are the grid stakeholders coming to Electricity Canada looking for support on, depending on their region? And are you seeing that north-south versus east-west issue playing out? Oh, sorry, you're still on mute.
There we go. Michael, just as you talk about the electrifying everything, in particular transportation, like that's so cool to hear about the ferry project. And I just keep thinking, wow, we really do need a lot more electricity. So we've been hearing, I'm sure you guys have as well, that we need a doubling or tripling of the amount of electricity currently generated in the next 20 to 30 years. So there's a lot of work to be done. And so just, Emma, to get to your question, different regions require different things. But if I were to consolidate everything, I would say that there's 3 themes that we're really hearing across all regions. So the first is funding. They need materials and they need people. So Lance, you've already spoken about the people piece. The biggest piece is something that we've already submitted to the federal government, and that's the inclusion of distribution and all transmission projects under the Clean Electricity Investment Tax Credits. Currently those are applicable to generation projects, but we know that transmission and distribution are going to help with those interties, whether it's east-west or north-south. The federal government is the biggest driver of the net zero legislation. We're really pleased that member companies with Electricity Canada all have their own net zero targets, but it really is a top-down regulated policy that our members are complying with. So I'm very pleased to see that the federal government knows that they now have a role to play in the electricity space, and this federal budget from 2023 was really how do I say? I think it was the first time that they've really directed federal funding to the electricity sector. So including distribution and transmission in the ITCs, I think it shows the progressiveness of the tax base to ensure that the net zero economy is fought for, but it's not penalizing low-income Canadians. The second piece that we're hearing from regions is really the supply chain issue. Is there enough stuff? Do we have enough transformers, wires, poles to upgrade the grid to meet the new demands? In particular, as we look at all the demands that will come from EVs and heat pumps. So we're looking to the federal government to continue to promote local manufacturing, just like they've done with the battery plants in Ontario. And then finally, we're hearing from regions, we're hearing from our member companies that there's a predicted huge shortage of labor. And some of these pieces will be filled. And we did hear this at our conference yesterday, and I'm sure you're hearing it as well. With AI, we had a speaker that was talking about the capacity of humanoids to do some of the work that we know there'll be a gap, but we still need people. Hydro-Quebec in its 2035 action plan, which they released a few weeks ago, estimated that one province will require 35,000 workers. So federal assistance for developing trade workers is going to be a really important part of the work that we do over the next couple of years. And our colleagues at Electricity Human Resources Canada have been saying this for a really long time. And their labor market research is also showing that the need for people to build out our sector is really important. But I think, again, Lance, just to your point, this is a really, really exciting time to be part of the sector. And at Electricity Canada, we're doing work in grade schools and middle schools to really promote the people piece. And sorry, I didn't speak to the north-south question there, but obviously we have major transmission lines going between Canada and the US. We have a really strong relationship. We work hard in Washington monthly. Our team is there and we're talking to congressmen and senators about the need for clean electricity in the United States. And really it's a win-win situation to continue to strengthen our relationship with the United States. So thank you for that question.
No problem. So, Maxime, you've been waiting very patiently, hearing all of this, the challenges and the exciting times we're in. As speaking to your slice of this, can you talk about the solutions? I think we're all aware that there are some big hills to climb, but the great thing about these types of discussions is that we can kick around ideas to solve them. And I'm so sorry, Lance, I just saw your hand. Is it urgent or?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in quickly on Julia's point and add one more interesting stat, if I can, Emma, so our economists at EY would estimate that in order to achieve energy transition, we're looking at investments, and this is across all sectors. So this isn't just, power and utility companies, but across all the sectors in Canada, that we're going to need to spend between 60 and 110 billion every year between now and 2050. And to Julia's point around, I think, the excitement and the transformation that we're going to see and the investment in infrastructure that companies like Stantec, for example, and others support. I mean, we haven't seen anything like this in generations. And so I think from a talent perspective, we're going to need huge numbers of people to support, that level of investment that's going to happen and that level of transformation. And I've got to say, the next 15, 20 years are going to be very exciting. Sorry to interject there, Emma, but.
No, because it's totally fine. Because I also, in addition to the actual nuts and bolts solutions for the grid and its infrastructure, I wanted Maxime to also touch on the people piece, which I'm sure, you're experiencing in real time. So if you could speak to both of those in terms of, how Eaton's dealing with the challenges there, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Well, as you know, at Eaton, as an intelligent and power management company, so we've developed a broad portfolio of products and services, which are all aligned with what we call here energy transition. And one big component of this energy transition is clearly the electrification of transportation, which, as you well mentioned, Emma, is bringing challenges to the grid. And it's actually pretty simple. So we have more and more EVs on the roads, which means more and more electricity needed for those electric vehicles to function properly. And as you can imagine, the existing grid in place, as Julia mentioned earlier, might not be sufficient enough to charge all of those EVs at the same time. And that's the important term to emphasize here. It's at the same time. So imagine everybody gets home at night at 6 p.m. and all of a sudden they all ask for power to charge their EVs, in addition to all of the other usual loads that the grid is already supporting. So the key here is really to focus on what we call load management. As I said earlier, the grid may not have the capabilities to charge the EVs all at the same time, but it definitely has the capability to charge them all at different periods of time. So when it comes to the solution to these challenges, today we have two solutions and two strategies that we are implementing to deal with the load profile of the EV electrification. So on one side of it, we have what we call the networked EV chargers. So in other words, we put the intelligence as part of the chargers. The chargers are connected. They have the ability to communicate via software that will dictate them to throttle their load based on the current demand. So for this solution, we've partnered with a Canadian-based company called ChargeLab. They are expert in this domain. And on the other side, the other solution that we put together is what we call the power management. So this is another approach that we've taken, that we've done through another partnership with Evolute, which is specifically for multi-unit residential building application. So one of the big barriers to EV adoption in cities is basically the ability to charge at home when you live in the multi-unit residential building, since the existing infrastructure might be limited in terms of power. So in this case, we've put the intelligence at the power distribution level within the electrical panel board, for instance. And doing this, we're managing the loads at the source using dedicated algorithm at the breaker level and not at the EV charger level, opposite way to the first solution I mentioned. So, and the big advantage of this solution is basically you're not using and you're not relying on any Wi-Fi network, which is most of the time a challenge when it comes to underground parking lots. But in the end, both those strategies that I've just mentioned, they have the same common denominator, which is limited power. And while the utilities are revamping and adding more resiliency, as Julia mentioned earlier, to their grid to meet this new demand, our solution are enabling right now more users to charge smarter by sharing power more efficiently and by taking advantage of low peak demands on the grid.
Thanks so much. And yeah, I mean, I think that idea of doing more with less is really, something that that just the position we're in right now. But just as a PS onto that, you answered one of the questions from the audience that came in early about digital technologies and how they can be used. But there's a follow-up question, particularly on the MERB side. Is it realistic to expect utilities to beef up distribution networks in dense urban environments so that all MERBs can be EV ready? Or is it more realistic that we would incorporate either the smart charger solution or perhaps a hybrid? Sorry, Maxime, that's to you.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I mean, today the position that we've taken is really to use the available power and to use it in a smarter way, because it gives the opportunity to all users today to charge their vehicle, taking into account that they have most of the time an overnight period, charging period of time. So instead of charging right away and be ready for the next day, we're using the available power within that period of time, which doesn't need the building or the utility to add more power. So that's the position we've taken today, and that allows all of the users today to charge at home right away.
Thanks so much. So Michael, bringing you in to talk about, obviously the consumer side of this is very critical for grid resiliency, but looping back in the commercial and fleet applications, could you highlight some of the solutions for heavy industrial commercial fleets that are being used to manage those massive swings that you were talking about earlier?
Sure, and I guess it kind of, to follow on some of Maxine's points as well as Lance's as well, certainly there's only so many levers you can pull as a utility initially to try to get more on your grid. And we have to be very cognizant of the phasing of when this is all going to happen. These vehicles aren't coming onto the grid, next week. So there is a time horizon associated with supply chains, with the battery plants coming up to speed, with the manufacturing facilities coming up to speed. Only so many of them can be sold and purchased. and incentivized, right? Because right now there's still a lot more money. So I guess what I'm getting at is, as the vehicles are coming on, we need strategies to deal with those different phases. Certainly some of the products that Maxime has talked about are applicable right away. I mean, these are things that you can apply to your facility without having to request a service upgrade. There's certainly things on the tariff side as well. We know they're doing things in BC, and we know they're doing things in other provinces, and starting in Ontario as well, where the utility can incentivize charging at different times to try to help balance out the network. That's very, I think it's the icing on the cake is what that is. You're not going to make a deep impact on that. Beyond that, as Maxime said, for fleets, the next lever is smart charging, better utilizing what you've got. So where you've got the ability to schedule those fleet charging, and they've been doing it for bus depots now for a while, and they're going to start to have to do it at these other logistic depots where you can figure out what your schedules are and you can balance out your grid. So you're flattening your load profile essentially. We are going to come to a point where there still isn't going to be enough power, and we're going to need a lot more strategies. And then this is back to Lance's point about DER and distributed generation. We're going to need more of that. And it might not necessarily be in the element of power. It might just be shifting. We've certainly seen battery storage take a front row seat with some of these applications. The two projects we're talking about, battery storage was studied for them. It's actually being implemented in the Ontario one. As an example, the grid to deliver power to these ferry vessels requires about 3 megawatts of power in 10 minutes. That's the ferry boarding time. The utility could only provide a megawatt, and that's really all they were going to be able to provide for any time horizon, at any point in time. So the strategy there was to co-locate battery energy storage at the ferry terminal, and the battery energy storage would slow charge as the vessel is en route from the grid. And then when the vessel docks, it would discharge, I call it blast charge, in combination with the grid power, and then charge the vessel battery. The benefit, obviously, it's called a non-wire solution is what that's called, because you're sort of supplementing the grid power with a battery storage project, and you're flattening out the load profile at the same time. Unfortunately, that doesn't really pencil out in all cases. But in Ontario, we have a very lucrative program called the Industrial Conservation Initiative, whereby if you can avoid the 5 provincial peaks, grid peaks, you can reduce your electricity costs by astronomical levels, 70 to 80%. So by participating in that program and oversizing the battery slightly to handle the ferry terminal load, they're able to use that program to help finance that grid battery that's also used for vessel charging. So it's a very interesting double play on what you're going to use the battery for. Now, when we explored that same opportunity in BC, it was slightly different. Again, these are major vessels. I think one of the larger vessels has a 60 megawatt charging demand. Like, most of us can't even fathom that. Like, this is like a large substation's worth of power, and this has to be delivered in 28 minutes. And then the vessel goes en route for 2 hours, comes back and does the same thing. So you're looking at the load factor on this grid, and it's just swinging madly, 60 and then down to nothing, right? And then swinging back up to 60. So we thought battery storage, perfect, right? You size the battery to flatten out that load profile so it's seeing the exact same demand all the time. Worked out great. Demand charges don't pay for it, and there's no ICI program. So in essence, the payback wasn't anywhere approachable for utilizing that technology. I think, as a sector, we need to look at this a little more closely. This is something that can really help the grid in cases where you can't do smart charging to flatten it. We definitely need certain demands at certain times. So that and other types of distributed generation located locally can really help to offset the demand when it occurs.
A very intense sounding problem, 60 megawatts. All right, so, Lance, we've got some great examples that have been brought into the conversation. How are the problems and solutions resonating with you when it comes to energy transmission, demand response, and management, and then incorporating that intelligent smart grid aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been shared, and specifically what Michael just shared, definitely resonates with me. There's two things I wanted to talk about. One is sort of building on some of those thoughts around this idea of an intelligent grid. And secondly, we've talked a lot about distribution and solutions in the distribution perspective, but we also need to think about transmission. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Let me start with the intelligent grid and kind of build on some of the thoughts. So, my perspective would be to keep pace with increasing energy demand and the future growth of the grid and the aging infrastructure. We will need to modernize and optimize power delivery and reliability for sure. We see the future grid being much more intelligent. We've seen examples of that in other parts of the world, and one that heavily leverages digital and information technologies really to, I guess, continuously optimize the electricity system in a way that enables customers to become, more active players in the energy transition. Think about vehicle to grid integration as an example. We already talked about DERS, solar. I mean, I've got a 9 kilowatt system, bidirectional meter on my roof, and I'm selling back to the grid when I'm not self-consuming electricity. And we've seen, the explosion of that, across Canada. More specifically around building an intelligent grid, there's probably four things that I would share. One, we need greater system resiliency, and we need to do that. And we've talked a little bit about proactively upgrading and transforming our grid infrastructure to really meet those emerging needs. Secondly, the talent piece, I come back to that because we need strong talent and capabilities that really enable integration and interconnection of, emerging technologies. Michael talked about storage, battery storage, EVs we've talked about. We're going to need more digital tools, and I think Maxime was alluding to some of this around AI, machine learning, because, when you're managing a centralized grid, that's far easier than managing a decentralized grid where you've got power generation occurring in thousands, hundreds of thousands of different places. So, as humans, we can't manage that without the use of AI and machine learning, because there's just increased levels of complexity. Likewise, from a cybersecurity perspective, this is an area that we see just becoming more and more important as we deploy more and more technology across our infrastructure, particularly when it comes to energy. It's important to protect that infrastructure. And then finally, fourthly, we need to invest in technology and data that provide kind of customer optionality and grid flexibility so that we can optimize kind of real time, particularly around visibility. The second theme that I just wanted to touch on quickly is just around transmission, because we talked a lot about distribution. I don't think we can forget that from a transmission infrastructure perspective, we're looking at potentially doubling or even tripling by 2050 transmission to support electrification. And so transmission systems, need to be called upon to play a key role in the future grid. It's not only distribution. And so, in my mind, transmission really resembles the backbone of energy infrastructure, given its link to economic development and potential to kind of unlock growth of renewables. And the potential for transmission in the energy transition can't be underestimated in my mind, as grid innovation has to be focused, more than just on distribution. And as it relates to transmission, data analytics should be, I think, a bigger part of transmission growth from a toolbox perspective. And obviously, when you get into transmission, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of Indigenous relations, because, their interaction from a transmission leadership perspective is very important. So I'll pause there.
No, it's a really important distinction to make between distribution and transmission, and feeding into that the DERs that you've been talking about. I just wanted to ask Maxime. We have some audience questions coming in about V2G and V2H. So I think the tradition, and Lance, I mean, feel free to push back on me on this, but I think the traditional model of transmission, it's probably going to change a little bit going forward. We have portable energy packs buzzing around on wheels, or we will at a high volume in the future. So Maxime, with that, transmitting electricity could come from V2G, V2H. Could you speak about how those smart technologies are going to integrate into the network and the role they'll play in future? And really, I think the questions, I'm paraphrasing a few, but how viable is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for now it's a little bit early, I think, to talk about V2G and V2H and even V2X. I know there are a lot of discussion about that. I know all car manufacturers, they are pretty much willing to open up that features on their vehicles. Some have done it, some are still haven't done it yet. But I think right now it's pretty limited and not fully commercialized. And I think that the biggest focus right now is really to try to understand the impact that this technology would have on the batteries. Because by doing V2G, you're definitely charging and discharging the batteries a lot. So I think that will be like an efficient technology in the future. But I would say that for now, we're still at the early stage. That's what I think for now.
And then Julia,
I don't know if Lance have some other thought about that on this topic.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I'm looking out kind of longer term, but so I guess Maxime, I would agree with you. I think it's going to be interesting to watch what's happening in Europe, as it appears that, like, I mean, I was there actually last month, and I mean, you've got, like, in places like Norway, 90% of new vehicles are EVs now. Like, the scale and the speed of electrification, acceleration of it is massive. So I think we are and will continue as a Canadian society. We're going to need to kind of watch other parts of Europe and other parts of the world that are a little bit ahead of us, and adapt and react appropriately. I don't know if you would agree with that, Maxime, but I think your premise is right.
Yeah, I'm fully agreeing with you. Like, as I said, I think we're all watching this closely, but also it's a little bit early to really have a definite opinion on this.
And Michael, I see your hand as well. And you're on mute, sorry.
I just wanted to jump in on kind of what you said, and I do totally agree with you, Maxime, that V2G has not quite progressed to the level that people would hope it would, with one exception. And I mean, I would say that, by and large, you purchase an electric vehicle, you purchase any vehicle, and your intent is to maximize the utilization of that vehicle. We look at how often our vehicles sit in the driveway, but from the standpoint of passenger vehicles, you just want to take your vehicle when you want to take it, and you don't necessarily want to be worried that you've got enough charge there to go back to the grid. And the only difference to that is school buses, right? School buses present a very real opportunity that exists today. And I should have mentioned it when we were talking about tools that potentially could be available to the grid, because they sit all summer long and they sit throughout the day for long periods of time, where you could basically park them close to a weak grid and have a connection for V2G and be able to utilize some of that battery and have that fleet operator earn some revenue from the grid services. So that's, I think, the only exception right now. Most other fleets that we look at are utilized, 20 out of 24 hours. So that you really have no opportunity, and those 4 hours are required for charging and getting the vehicle ready to go. But school buses is one that I would just jump in on.
You too, Lance.
Yeah, Michael, what you reminded me of, and I don't know if you've come across much of this globally yet, but this idea that airports are a really interesting opportunity as it relates to this, because you've got, like, large volumes of vehicles that are parked for long periods of time. and how do we better leverage that as we think about distributed energy and energy storage. Anyway, just a thought that I came across recently that I thought was really interesting.
I get very excited when people talk about electrifying aviation. It's like that extreme end of the spectrum, can we, are we ever going to? So that's an interesting idea that they could be, part of this this solution as well in that way. Julie, I know you thought you were going to escape. I just want to bring you back into the discussion here. We've sort of canvassed the V2G thing, but outside of that, how far off do you think Canada's grids are from implementing all of the solutions that have been canvassed today? And are there any that you'd like to add that haven't been flagged yet?
Am I on mute? No. Okay. I think that's a difficult question. The work is happening now. Every time I meet with one of our electricity utilities, I'm amazed by the innovations that are happening. I think the federal government supports are helpful, and seeing that capital go out to our members will just allow them to build bigger and faster. I think part of the problem that we're seeing is permitting. If we need more electricity to support all of these new technologies, a growing fleet of electric vehicles, it is taking members, up to a decade to get a large scale generation project through the regulatory approvals process. So I think that we need to be building now if we're going to be meeting our 2035 goals. So we're already looking ahead to 2050 and making sure that we can support the larger net zero by 2050 economy, as opposed to the 2035 grid, because the work that needs to be done, it has started. We're optimistic, but at the same time, we're really looking at a goal that is like 12 years from now. And, it takes all of this time to get a project through. So I didn't answer your question. It's happening now. I think it will happen sooner than we think. If we look at the coal phase out that's been occurring across Canada, that seemed so impossible 15 years ago when it became a government mandate. But Alberta will be off coal by the end of this year if they're not already. And so I think these targets are really good. They give us something to work towards. But as the government knows, and this is what our association says to them regularly, we need to move faster. We need to see that capital rolled out faster. We need the regulatory process to be reduced and thought through, so that our companies can continue to build out the infrastructure that we need.
No, that's great. I mean, that accelerating and cutting, red tape and being more efficient was a huge piece in the economic statement that was released yesterday. So I think there is an awareness that is an issue, just getting these projects built in time. Mm-hmm. Just feeding into an audience question for that. Are there things municipalities can do to show that their grid is ready to handle their goal set in climate change action plans? Is there anything that they can do to signal like, hey, we're ready for this?
And that would be signaling to their customers or the feds, or was there?
It wasn't specified, but I suppose it would just be signaling to the public that we're stable, we're ready.
I think that I'm seeing in actually last week, the Electricity Canada sponsored the EV Awards, and we did this in Edmonton at the Electric Mobility Canada conference, and we did give an award to a city, a municipality that's been promoting EVs. So just like really signaling that you're working to educate your audience and the customers, that your infrastructure is ready. I think is good. our members are always talking about energy literacy and making sure that their customers are prepared for what's coming, that they understand the growing need to be literate in terms of your own decisions regarding electricity use. But just continuing to educate the public, whether it's in bill inserts, that's a really popular one, and applying to these awards so that we know the good work that you're doing. But sorry, that's a tricky one to answer. Quest Canada does really, really good work with regards to municipalities and making sure that municipalities are preparing their customers for the future. So their team is doing excellent work in this area.
Thanks so much. Michael, I see your hand. And I also want to, happy to hear what you have to say in response to what I assume is the other panelists, but also someone's asking about if you can speak more about marine transport and how charging these vehicles would work. The example is especially, in Ontario during the winter.
Sure, I can address. I wanted to sort of jump on a couple of the points that have already been made, which, certainly, Julie, you did answer the question when you were talking about permitting and getting started right away. I wanted to jump on that because we forgot to mention things like SMRs, right? There's a really good example. If you're looking at small modular reactors, being able to add clusters of non-emitting power in communities and trying to improve that licensing requirement for them and trying to expedite it. And there's other technologies that are sort of like that as well. I guess in answer to the question, it's more related with let me just review this now. Yeah, so again, during the winter is really no different than any other time. What we end up doing for this particular project is, obviously the batteries have to have a readiness, just like your car in the driveway. If you leave your Tesla parked in the driveway in the winter and you go to charge it, it's going to take a lot longer to charge that battery, and you're not going to get the capacity out of it. The same would apply to any type of vessel or large fleet battery in the winter. I think the idea is keeping the battery conditioned, keeping it warm, and keeping it in the state. So the 4 or 5 hours that the vessel is not being operated, the idea would be to keep the vessel and the battery system warm. I think that's the way it's dealt with. Most of these vessels that are coming in to service, especially the Damen ones that we're seeing in Ontario and in BC in similar ferry classes, they're hybrids right now. So I think nobody's jumping in all in. I mean, they're an electric vessel, but they have a diesel engine to back up the battery, or the diesel engine is used to charge the battery in the event that the infrastructure isn't ready to go and they need to run it, or the infrastructure is down. So like if you've got a grid event and the infrastructure is down, you still need to operate emergency ferry service. You still have the hybrid. So I think a combination of battery conditioning and probably hybrid type systems initially coming on, much like they did in the EV world. We saw hybrids have been on the market now for decades, right? And it's just only recently that all electric, since battery costs have come down, have become more viable.
Thanks so much. Lance, I'm not sure if EY gets a lot of clients in this area or does a lot of research, but we have a question about home energy storage and that increasing the resiliency of grids and managing loads. Are you able to speak to that?
That might be a better question for Maxime or maybe Julia. I don't want to give an off the cuff answer, actually.
Okay, no problem. Maxime, Julia, do you have anything to say about home energy storage?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it a little bit. So I would say for now, I don't think there's like a lot of, in terms of like a manufacturer's perspective, I don't think there are like a lot of solution out there in the market. I think it's coming, same as the V2G discussion that we had earlier. And yes, I think it might be like a solution to overpass the the peaks in the grid in the future. But also, I think more than just like giving storage, whether it's at home or elsewhere, I think also what we need to understand is that we're dealing with the people behavior here. And when it comes to EV charging, for instance, I think we will not will probably not change the way people are doing today. So most of the people will not change their habit for the grid itself. So they're used to do like a quick stop to the gas station whenever they need today. So it might be hard to change those habits, which I think is why smart devices combined to utilities incentives might definitely help to build a more resilient grid. And when I mean smart devices, I'm specifically thinking about something that we have developed here at Eaton, which we call the smart breakers, that gives also data, to come back to Lance's point at the beginning of the webinar. So data, like we have some open API with data open for the utilities. So that will definitely help the utility to predict what's coming and to also control the loads from a consumer point of view. So those technology, I think, combined with some utilities incentives, and I can think about one here in Quebec, which is Hilo, which is a Hydro-Quebec subsidiary. So they've put some program in place where they're trying to avoid the peak, especially in winter when everybody's using electricity for heating. So by using this kind of smart device combined to these incentives to avoid and shed that peak, I think that can be also another solution to build that grid more resilient.
Thanks so much. And Lance, I'm going to hold you to answering this one because it just speaks to your comment or your observation that north-south is working a bit better than east-west. And the question is, does the federal government need to create laws to encourage better interprovincial flows of electricity? And I don't know how much knowledge you have about the Atlantic Loop, but that's kind of the example that jumps to the front of my mind when I think about multiple jurisdictions trying to move power around them. And that one had its challenges, but I'll let you answer now.
Well, Emma, it's a big question that I have spent some time thinking about, and also speaking about with some of the major power and utility CEOs. This idea of a trans-Canadian kind of infrastructure corridor, which from time to time different commentators talk about, whether that corridor be electrons or molecules. If you were to kind of redesign the Canadian system from scratch, you'd be like, yeah, that makes a ton of sense, because the reality is that 80% of the power generation that we have today is renewable in the country, but we have certain provinces that don't have the adequate level of interties that are primarily hydrocarbons. So if you were to optimize the system, you would say, yeah, like sharing of those electrons more broadly across the country makes massive sense. And from an energy strategy perspective, makes a lot of sense as well. But I mean, that requires, I think, massive change in policy and changes to our constitution, which is incredibly problematic in this country. The flip side of that, though, is that the decentralized system that we have does provide a huge amount of redundancy in that, from a cybersecurity perspective, where we do have these separate systems that, you don't have this tight integration, that from an energy security perspective is very good for our country, and supports that. So I can see both sides of the argument, but I also see some specific challenges. I mean, in Alberta, where I live, one of the big debates here is around the clean electricity regulation and the impact that that will have on our province. Mm-hmm. Obviously, because we use a lot of gas. And there's a lot of thinking going on right now in this province around, okay, how do we incorporate carbon capture, sequestration? What does that look like? How do we manage the base load, which we talked about earlier? There's some big challenges around that, but opportunities as well.
Thank you so much. Julia, I saw you nodding along there. I know we all probably have more to say on this. Unfortunately, we do have to cut the conversation there, and I'll hand back to Nino. But thank you so much to our audience who's been incredibly engaged. I didn't even have to ask for questions. It was amazing that, clearly very knowledgeable and invested. So thanks for participating. And also to our panelists, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. It's really appreciated. And Nino, back to you.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo those thanks and add mine. Thank you, Emma, for moderating and bringing the panel together. And just thanks to Maxime, Julia, Lance, and Michael for really stepping up to share your knowledge and expertise. It's leaders like these who really help us inform other actors in the market to understand what's going on. So incredibly grateful to everybody for doing that. So thank you very much. And a big thank you again to our sponsors of this episode, Eaton. And they've very grateful for those who help make our programming possible. And just before we wrap, a couple of announcements for you. Next week, we have the 4th part of this 5-part national discussion series and another expert panel for you. They will discuss how our charging infrastructure can support medium and heavy duty fleets. You can see the link. It's going to be dropped into the chat, I think, any moment now. And or you can actually access that from the events tab on the homepage of our website if you'd like to register. And also we have coming up a live event in February the 7th next year. If you work in EV advanced manufacturing or EV supply chain, you'll want to join us at the EV Innovation and Technology Conference in Toronto. This year's event was sold out 2 weeks prior. So now's a good time to book if you're interested in taking part. The link again should be appearing in the chat, but you can also access that link from the Electric Autonomy website. So thanks for being part of the discussion today, and thanks for your questions, and see you next week.